The summer I turned 22, I thought I had everything figured out. I was wrong about almost everything, but especially about Mason. He wasn't technically my half-brother. Our parents had married when we were both in high school, making us stepbrothers by law, but strangers by circumstance. We'd orbited each other politely for years, exchanging nods at holiday dinners and awkward small talk during family gatherings. But that summer, when we both ended up back home after college with nowhere else to go and nothing but time stretching ahead of us, everything changed in ways I never could have predicted. I remember the exact moment it started. It was late June, and the heat had settled over our small town like a heavy blanket that refused to be shaken off. I'd been lying on the couch scrolling mindlessly through my phone when Mason appeared in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen window. He'd changed since I'd last really looked at him, filled out, grown into himself. His hair was longer, touching his collar, and there was a confidence in the way he carried himself that hadn't been there before. "Hey," he said, and even his voice seemed different, deeper. "Want to do something?" I'm losing my mind in this house. Ended up at the old quarry outside town, a place we'd both heard about but never visited together. The water was impossibly blue, reflecting the cloudless sky, and the rocks were warm beneath our feet as we picked our way down to the edge. Mason pulled off his shirt without hesitation, and I found myself looking away quickly, unsure why my heart had suddenly started beating faster. We spent the afternoon diving off the rocks, racing across the water, laughing in a way that felt both foreign and strangely natural. When we finally collapsed on the sun-warmed stone, breathing hard and grinning at each other, something shifted. The space between us felt charged, electric in a way I couldn't name. After that day, we were inseparable. Every morning one of us would knock on the other's door and we'd disappear into the summer heat together. We explored every forgotten corner of our hometown, abandoned buildings covered in graffiti, hiking trails that wound through dense forests, diners where the coffee was terrible, but the pie made up for it. Mason had a way of making everything feel like an adventure, turning the mundane into something magical just by being there. He'd point out details I'd never noticed before, tell stories that made me see familiar places in completely new ways. I found myself watching him more than I watched where we were going, caught by the way sunlight moved across his face or how his eyes crinkled when he laughed. It was during one of our late night drives that I first felt it's that dangerous warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with friendship. We'd been talking about nothing and everything, the way you do at 2 a.m. when sleep feels optional and the world outside the car windows seems suspended in time. Mason had been telling me about a girl he'd dated in college, how it had ended badly, how he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. His voice had gone quiet, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. "Sometimes I think I've been looking in all the wrong places," he said, staring out at the empty road ahead. "Like maybe what I'm looking for has been right in front of me the whole time, and I've been too scared to see it." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it in the quiet car. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to turn and look at him, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road. "Scared of what?" I managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then I felt his hand, warm and tentative, settle on my shoulder. "Scared of changing everything," he said softly. "Scared of losing something important because I wanted more than I should." I didn't trust myself to respond. Didn't trust what might come out if I opened my mouth. So I just drove in silence, while his hand stayed on my shoulder and my entire world tilted on its axis. The next few weeks were torture in the sweetest possible way. Every casual touch felt loaded with meaning. I was afraid to examine too closely. When Mason would lean over my shoulder to see what I was looking at on my phone, I'd catch the scent of his shampoo and have to remind myself to breathe. When we'd sprawl on opposite ends of the couch watching movies, I'd find myself hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, wanting to close it but terrified of what that would mean. I started lying awake at night, replaying conversations, looking for hidden meanings and throwaway comments, driving myself half crazy, trying to figure out if I was imagining the way his gaze would linger on me just a beat too long. Everything came to a head on the 4th of July. Our parents had gone to a barbecue at a friend's house, leaving Mason and me alone. We decided to skip the festivities, preferring our own company to crowds and forced socializing. We'd spent the day being lazy as sleeping late, making elaborate breakfasts, reading on the back porch while summer storms rolled in and out. As evening approached, Mason suggested we climb onto the roof to watch the fireworks that would be going off around town. It was something we'd talked about doing, but never had, and something about the idea felt momentous, like we were crossing an invisible line we'd been dancing around all summer. The roof was still warm from the day's heat. We settled side by side on the slope, shoulders touching, legs stretched out in front of us. The first fireworks started just as the sky was turning that deep purple blue of twilight. Distant booms echoed across the valley, and colorful explosions bloomed against the darkening sky. But I couldn't focus on them. All I could feel was the solid warmth of Mason pressed against my side, the way our breathing had somehow synchronized. When I finally worked up the courage to turn my head and look at him, I found he was already looking at me. His expression was open, vulnerable, searching for something in my face. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant fireworks. My mouth went dry. I've been trying to figure out how to say this all summer. Hell, maybe longer than that. Shifted slightly, turning toward me, and suddenly we were face to face. Close enough that I could see the different colors in his eyes. Close enough to count his eyelashes if I wanted to. Being around you this summer has been, I don't know, it's been everything. And I keep trying to convince myself that what I'm feeling is just, I don't know, brotherly affection or something. But it's not. It's so much more than that, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't. My heart felt like it might explode out of my chest. Every nerve in my body was screaming, and I couldn't tell if it was panic or joy or some overwhelming combination of both. "Mason," I started, but I had no idea what I was going to say. He reached out slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and cupped my face with one hand. His palm was warm, slightly rough, grounding. "Tell me I'm not crazy," he whispered. "Tell me you feel it too." I couldn't form words, so I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I closed the small distance between us and pressed my lips to his. The world exploded into color. Though whether it was the fireworks or just what I felt I couldn't say, Mason made a small sound against my mouth, surprised and relieved all at once, and then he was kissing me back. His hand slid from my face into my hair, and I grabbed the front of his shirt like I was afraid he might disappear if I didn't hold on tight enough. We kissed like we were trying to make up for lost time, like we were discovering something we didn't know had been missing. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead dropped against mine and he laughed a shaky, disbelieving sound that made my chest feel too small to contain everything I was feeling. "We should probably talk about this," he said. But he was smiling, and his hand was still in my hair, and I'd never seen him look happier. "We should," I agreed, and then I was kissing him again, because talking suddenly seemed vastly overrated. We stayed on that roof until long after the fireworks ended, alternating between kissing and talking, and just sitting in stunned silence, processing what we'd just admitted to each other. Mason told me about the moment he'd first realized his feelings had shifted, how terrified he'd been, how he'd been dropping hints all summer hoping I'd pick up on them. I told him about my sleepless nights, my confusion, the way I'd been afraid to even acknowledge what I was feeling because of what it might mean. The next morning felt surreal. I woke up with my phone full of texts from Mason, sent at some ungodly hour when he apparently couldn't sleep. They were a mix of sweet and funny and nervous, asking if I was okay, if I regretted anything, telling me he couldn't stop smiling. I lay in bed reading them over and over, grinning like an idiot at my phone. When I finally made it downstairs, he was in the kitchen making coffee. Our eyes met, and for a second we just stared at each other, and then we were both laughing, giddy, and relieved. "So that actually happened," he said. "That actually happened," I confirmed. And then he was crossing the kitchen and kissing me good morning, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But reality has a way of crashing in when you least expect it. We'd been living in our own private bubble, but we couldn't ignore the complications forever. The fact that our parents were married, that we lived under the same roof, that everyone in our lives thought of us as brothers, It all suddenly seemed impossibly complicated. We had whispered conversations late at night about what it meant, what we were going to do, whether we should tell anyone. Mason was terrified of how our parents would react, worried they'd think it was somehow wrong or inappropriate. I was afraid too, but more than that. I was afraid of losing what we'd just found. We decided to keep it quiet for a while, just until we figured things out. It should have been simple, but hiding something that felt so right was harder than I'd imagined. Every time we were around our parents, I had to be careful not to let my gaze linger too long, not to stand too close, not to touch him the way I wanted to. Mason was better at it than I was, or maybe just better at pretending. But I could see the strain in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd catch my eye across the room with an expression that was equal parts longing and frustration. We stole moments when we could late-night drives where we could hold hands. Early mornings, before anyone else was awake, when we could just be ourselves. About 2 weeks after that night on the roof, everything nearly fell apart. There was a girl from Mason's college who came to visit, someone he'd been friends with, and I watched them hug at the door with a surge of jealousy so intense it physically hurt. I knew it was irrational, knew Mason had told me there was nothing there, but seeing her touch his arm, seeing them laugh together, made all my insecurities come rushing to the surface. I couldn't watch, couldn't stand there and pretend to be the friendly stepbrother. So I disappeared to my room and tried to convince myself I wasn't being ridiculous. I failed spectacularly at that. Mason came to find me after she left. He didn't knock, just walked in and sat on the edge of my bed, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're upset," he said. It wasn't a question. I wanted to deny it, but I was tired of hiding what I felt, even from him. "Maybe a little," I admitted. He reached out and took my hand, threading our fingers together. "She's just a friend. You know that, right?" I did know that, logically. But emotions aren't always logical. "I know," I said. Seeing someone else touch you, I couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to." Mason's expression softened. He said gently, using his free hand to tilt my chin up so I had to look at him. "You're the only one I want. The only one I think about. The only one who makes me feel like this." His voice dropped lower, more intense. "I know this situation is complicated and messy, and sometimes I don't know how we're going to make it work. But I've never been more sure of anything than I am about you." He leaned in slowly, giving me time to close the distance. And when I did, kissing him felt like coming home. We stayed like that for a long time, tangled together on my bed, whispering promises and reassurances, tapping the contours of each other's faces with gentle fingers. That night changed something between us. The uncertainty, the doubts, the fear, they didn't disappear entirely, but they became manageable. We started making plans, talking about the future in concrete terms instead of vague hypotheticals. Mason had a job lined up in the city starting in September, and I'd been accepted to a graduate program there. We could get an apartment together, we realized. We could build something real, away from the complications of our family situation. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, but for the first time it felt possible. We spent hours lying in the dark, talking about what our life could look like, painting pictures with words of a future that was finally ours to create. August arrived too quickly, bringing with it the reality that our summer was ending. We had about 3 weeks left before we'd both be leaving, and every day felt precious in a way that made my chest ache. We stopped wasting time on sleep, stayed up until dawn more often than not, trying to cram a lifetime's worth of moments into the shrinking time we had left. Mason took me to all his favorite places, showed me all the spots that had been important to him growing up. He was giving me pieces of himself to hold on to. I did the same, and it felt like we were building a shared history, a foundation for whatever came next. One afternoon, about a week before we were set to leave, Mason took my hand as we were walking through the park downtown. It was a bold move. We were in public, in our hometown, where everyone knew us, but he didn't seem to care anymore. I looked at him, surprised, and he just smiled. "I'm tired of hiding," he said simply. "I'm tired of acting like you're not the most important person in my world." My heart swelled so large I thought it might burst. We walked through town hand in hand, and if anyone noticed or cared, I was too happy to register it. We ended up at the coffee shop where we'd spent so many afternoons that summer. And the barista who knew us both smiled and asked if we were finally together. Apparently, we'd been less subtle than we thought. The last few days before, we left past in a blur of packing and planning and last family dinners. Our parents still didn't know we'd decided to tell them once we were settled in the city. Once we had our own space and some distance, it felt like the coward's way out sometimes, but it also felt necessary. We needed to build our own foundation first. Needed to prove to ourselves that this was real and lasting before we tried to explain it to anyone else. The night before we left, we lay on my bedroom floor side by side, staring at the ceiling, fingers intertwined between us. "You scared?" Mason asked quietly. Terrified, I admitted. "You." "Completely," he said, and then he turned his head to look at me. But also really excited. "Is that weird?" I turned to face him too, our noses almost touching. "No," I said. "I think that's exactly right." Moving day was chaos, 2 cars packed to bursting, our parents fussing and offering last-minute advice, emotions running high. But through it all, every time I caught Mason's eye, I felt calm. We were doing this together. We were building something together. When we finally pulled away from the house, watching our parents wave goodbye in the rearview mirror, Mason reached over and squeezed my hand. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, and then he started laughing. "What?" I asked, smiling despite not knowing what was funny. "We did it," he said, still laughing, sounding amazed and relieved. "We actually did it. We're free." And he was right. For the first time in our lives, we were completely, utterly free. The apartment we'd found was small but perfecta. 3rd floor walk-up with big windows that let in lots of light and just enough space for the 2 of us. We spent the first few days setting it up, arguing good-naturedly about where furniture should go, discovering each other's quirks and habits in new ways. Mason was messy, but made amazing coffee. I was organized, but couldn't cook to save my life. He sang in the shower, off-key and loud. I talked in my sleep, apparently saying the strangest things. Every discovery felt like a gift, another piece of the puzzle of building a life together. We were learning each other in ways we never could have back home. And I fell more in love with him every single day. About 2 weeks after we moved in, we had our first real fight. It was stupid, something about whose turn it was to do dishes. But it escalated quickly because we were both stressed and overwhelmed with starting new jobs and school. Mason stormed off to the bedroom, and I stood in the kitchen fuming, wondering if we'd made a terrible mistake. But then I thought about everything we'd been through, everything we'd risked to be together, and I realized that one fight didn't erase any of that. I went to the bedroom, found Mason sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," I said. He looked up, his eyes red, and my heart broke a little. "I'm sorry too," he said, and then we were holding each other. And the fight suddenly seemed so insignificant compared to everything else. We made a rule after that, never go to bed angry. Some nights it meant staying up late to talk things through, but it was worth it. We learned to communicate better, to express our needs and frustrations before they built up into something explosive. Mason learned that I needed alone time to recharge. I learned that he needed physical affection to feel secure. We figured out our rhythms, our patterns, the way we fit together. And through it all, the physical side of our relationship deepened not just the passion, but the intimacy, the vulnerability of being completely yourself with another person. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word in the darkness felt like a promise that we were building something that would last. We finally told our parents at Thanksgiving. We'd been putting it off, finding excuses, but it was time. We drove back home together, both nervous, hands clasped tightly the entire way. Over dinner, with everyone gathered around the table, Mason cleared his throat and said, "We had something to tell them." I watched our parents' faces as we explained carefully, honestly emphasizing that this hadn't happened when we were kids. We weren't actually related by blood, that this was real and serious. There was shock, definitely, confusion, a long, terrible silence. But then Mason's mom started crying, and I thought it was over, but she came around the table and hugged us both tightly. "I just want you to be happy," she said. Both of you. My dad took longer to come around. He didn't say much that night, just sat with this look on his face like he was trying to process something impossible. But the next morning, he knocked on the door of my old room where Mason and I were staying. "Can we talk?" he asked, and my stomach dropped. We went downstairs, and he made coffee with shaking hands. "This is hard for me to understand," he admitted. "I always thought of you two as brothers. But I can see how you look at each other. I can see that it's real." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "I don't understand it, but I don't have to. You're both adults. You're both good people. And if you make each other happy, then I'll learn to be okay with it." It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, conversations that didn't go quite right, family members who didn't know how to react. But slowly, over time, people adjusted. They saw how we were together, how happy we made each other, and most of them came around eventually. Some didn't, and that hurt. But we had each other. We had friends who loved and supported us. We were building a community, a chosen family that understood and accepted us completely, and that was enough. Our first year in the city flew by in a whirlwind of new experiences. We explored every neighborhood, found our favorite restaurants and hidden spots. Mason thrived at his job, got promoted faster than anyone expected. My graduate program was challenging, but fulfilling. And Mason was there through every late-night study session, every stressed-out meltdown, bringing me coffee and encouragement in equal measure. We made friends, other couples who got what it was like to build a life with someone. And suddenly, we weren't just two people alone against the world. We had a community, a support system, a life that felt rich and full. We had our challenges, of course. Money was tight sometimes, and we had to learn to budget, to sacrifice, to make choices about what mattered most. There were days when the city felt too big, too overwhelming. When we both just wanted to go home, except home wasn't a place anymore, it was each other. We learned to create our own sanctuary, our own peace within the chaos. We developed rituals: Sunday morning coffee on the fire escape, Friday night movies on the couch, random weekday adventures when we both needed to feel spontaneous. These small moments became the texture of our life together, the foundation on which everything else was built. On our 1-year anniversary of moving to the city, Mason surprised me. He'd been acting strange all day, nervous and secretive, and I couldn't figure out why. That evening, he took me to the roof of our building. Someone had set up string lights, and there were blankets spread out. And for a moment, I was transported back to that night on our parents' roof when everything had changed. Mason took my hands, and I could feel them trembling slightly. 1 year ago, he said, we took the biggest risk of our lives. We decided to build something together, despite all the reasons we shouldn't. And it's been the best year of my life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, and my heart stopped. "I know we can't get married yet, not legally, not with our family situation being what it is. But I want you to know that I'm committed to you, that I choose you every day for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." He opened the box to reveal 2 simple silver bands. "So I guess what I'm asking is, will you be my partner? In every way that matters?" I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, so I just nodded frantically and pulled him into a kiss that said everything I couldn't put into words. We put the rings on each other's fingers, and it felt more real. It's more meaningful than any ceremony could have been. That was 3 years ago now. We're still in the same apartment, though we've talked about moving somewhere bigger. Mason's career has taken off, and I finished my graduate program with job offers waiting. We've had highs and lows, good days and bad days, moments of perfect clarity and moments of complete confusion. We've fought and made up, hurt each other and forgiven each other, learned and grown and become better versions of ourselves in the process. Our families have mostly come around, and the awkwardness has faded into a new normal. We're not stepbrothers anymore in any meaningful way. We're partners, companions, the loves of each other's lives. Sometimes I think about that summer, about the boy who knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to do something because he was losing his mind. I think about how neither of us could have known where that simple question would lead. How one afternoon at a quarry would change the trajectory of both our lives. People ask us sometimes how we knew, how we were brave enough to risk everything for something so uncertain. And the truth is, I'm not sure we were brave at all. We were just two people who found something real in each other and decided it was worth fighting for. Consequences be damned. Mason is in the kitchen right now, making dinner and singing off-key like he always does. In a minute, I'll get up and go wrap my arms around him from behind, and he'll lean back into me like he always does, and it will be ordinary and perfect and exactly what I need. This is our life now. Not perfect, not without challenges, but ours. We built it together from nothing, from that first moment when we really saw each other, and every day we choose to keep building it. That's what love is, I think. Not the dramatic moments or the grand gestures, but the daily choice to show up, to stay, to keep choosing each other even when it's hard. The string lights on our fire escape are flickering in the evening breeze, and through the window I can see the city stretched out below us. Millions of lives being lived, millions of stories unfolding. Ours is just one among many, but it's ours, and that makes it everything. Mason calls my name, asking if I want wine with dinner, and I smile. Yeah, I call back. I'm coming. And as I stand up to join him, I catch sight of the ring on my finger. The simple silver band that represents a promise we made to each other on a rooftop under string lights. It catches the fading sunlight, and for just a moment, everything feels absolutely perfect. This is what he showed me, that some are not just love, but the courage to reach for it. And I've been reaching ever since. The seasons changed around us like pages turning in a book we were writing together. Fall became winter. Winter melted into spring, and with each passing month, our life together felt less like something we were building and more like something that had always existed. It's just waiting for us to find it. We learned the language of each other's silences, the meaning behind every glance and gesture. Mason could tell when I was stressed just by the way I held my shoulders. I knew when he was upset because he'd get quiet and retreat into himself, and I'd learned exactly how to draw him back out. Work became demanding for both of us. Mason's company was expanding rapidly, and he was being pulled in a dozen different directions at once. My own job was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. It's filled with office politics and expectations that sometimes felt crushing. We'd come home exhausted, barely able to form coherent sentences, and collapse on the couch together. But even in those moments of pure exhaustion, there was comfort. Mason would run his fingers through my hair absently while scrolling through his phone, and I'd rest my head on his shoulder, and somehow that simple contact would recharge us enough to face another day. The small things became everything. We had our first major crisis about 18 months into living together. Mason's father, his biological father, who he hadn't seen since he was a kid, reached out unexpectedly. The man had found Mason through social media and wanted to reconnect. Full of apologies and explanations and promises to do better, Mason was a mess. He'd pretend he was fine during the day, maintaining that calm exterior he was so good at, but at night he'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, as I could practically hear the thoughts racing through his mind. I didn't know how to help, didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound hollow or meaningless. So I just held him and let him talk when he needed to, stayed quiet when he didn't. He decided to meet his father, and I went with him. We drove to a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us knew, somewhere neutral and safe. Mason's hands were shaking as we walked in, and I squeezed them gently before letting go. His father was already there, older than I'd expected, wearing an expression of nervous hope that made my chest tight. I sat at a nearby table, close enough to be there if Mason needed me, but far enough to give them privacy. I watched Mason's face as they talked, saw him cycle through a dozen different emotions in the span of an hour. When they finally stood to leave, Mason looked drained, but somehow lighter, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for years. In the car on the way home, Mason broke down. Not in anger or sadness exactly, but in some complicated emotion that seemed to be both and neither at once. He apologized, Mason said, his voice cracking. He actually apologized. Said he was young and stupid and scared, and that leaving was the worst mistake he ever made. He wiped at his eyes roughly, frustrated with himself for crying. And part of me wants to forgive him, wants to believe that people can change. But another part of me is just... angry. Angry that he thinks he can show up now and expect everything to be okay. Angry that I even care what he thinks. I reached over and took his hand, held it tight. You're allowed to feel all of those things? I said quietly. You don't have to choose just one. Mason did start building a tentative relationship with his father, though it was slow and careful and full of bumps along the way. Watching him navigate that was hard sometimes. There were days when his father would cancel plans at the last minute, and Mason would try to act like it didn't matter, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. There were other days when they'd have a good conversation, and Mason would come home hopeful, almost happy, and I'd see glimpses of the kid he must have been before his father left. I supported him through all of it, but privately I was protective, ready to step in if his father hurt him too badly. Mason knew and loved me for it, even if he never said it out loud. Around that same time, we started talking seriously about the future. Not just vague plans anymore, but concrete decisions about what we wanted our life to look like. Did we want to stay in the city long term, or eventually move somewhere quieter? Did we want kids someday? What did success look like to us, both individually and as a couple? These conversations happened late at night, in the dark, when it felt safe to voice our deepest hopes and fears. Mason admitted he'd always imagined having kids, but wasn't sure how that would work given our situation. I told him I'd never really thought about it before him, but now I could picture it, a house full of noise and life. Tiny humans with his smile and stubborn streak. We started volunteering at an LGBTQ+ youth center on weekends. It had started as Mason's idea. He'd seen a flyer at a coffee shop and suggested we check it out. But it quickly became one of the most meaningful parts of our lives. These kids, many of them dealing with families who didn't accept them, struggling with their identities, feeling alone in the world, they reminded us of how lucky we were. We ran a support group together, and Mason was incredible at it. He had this way of making people feel seen and heard, of sharing his own story in a way that gave others permission to share theirs. Watching him with these kids, I fell in love with him all over again. One night, a 17-year-old kid named Jamie stayed after group to talk. He was struggling with whether to come out to his parents, terrified of their reaction, but tired of hiding. Mason and I sat with him for over an hour, sharing our own experiences, acknowledging that we couldn't tell him what to do, but we'd support him whatever he decided. When Jamie finally left, he hugged us both tightly. "You two give me hope," he said quietly. "Seeing that it's possible to have what you have, it makes me think maybe I can too." After he left, Mason turned to me with tears in his eyes. "We're making a difference," he said, sounding amazed. "We're actually helping people." I realized that this right here was what I wanted our legacy to be. Our third anniversary of moving to the city came and went quietly. We were both busy with work and hadn't planned anything elaborate. But Mason surprised me by taking the day off without telling me, showing up at my office at lunch with a picnic basket. We went to the park where we'd first held hands in public, spread out a blanket under the same tree, and ate sandwiches and talked about everything and nothing. 3 years, Mason said at one point, shaking his head like he couldn't quite believe it. Sometimes it feels like 3 decades, and sometimes it feels like 3 days. I knew exactly what he meant. The time had been both endless and fleeting, packed full of so many moments that had shaped who we were becoming. That evening, back at home, Mason pulled out a photo album I'd never seen before. "I've been working on this," he explained, looking almost shy. It was filled with pictures from our time together, some I remembered taking, others I didn't even know existed. There we were at the quarry that first day, sun-soaked and grinning. There we were, moving into the apartment, surrounded by boxes and looking overwhelmed. There we were at the youth center at family dinners, on random Tuesday nights, eating takeout on the couch. Mason had added captions to many of them, little notes about what we'd been doing or feeling in that moment. The last page was blank except for a single line, still writing our story. I couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but pull him close and hold on tight. Work took a turn for both of us around that time. Mason was offered a promotion that would mean significantly more money, but also significantly more hours and stress. I was offered a position at a different company that would be a major step up in my career, but would require some travel. We had long discussions about what we wanted, what we were willing to sacrifice, what was non-negotiable. In the end, Mason took the promotion, and I took the new job, and we made a promise to each other that work would never come before us. We'd already seen too many couples fall apart because careers took priority over relationships. And we were determined not to let that happen to us. The new schedules were hard to adjust to. There were weeks when we barely saw each other. I'd be traveling, and Mason would be working late, and we'd only connect through texts and late-night phone calls. But we made it work. We scheduled date nights like business meetings, protected them fiercely, refused to let anything interfere. We left notes for each other around the apartment on the bathroom mirror, tucked into lunch bags, stuck to the coffee maker. Small reminders that even when we weren't physically together, we were thinking of each other. Mason started a tradition of sending me a song every morning when I was traveling, something that reminded him of me or how he was feeling. I'd listen to them on planes and in hotel rooms and feel less alone. One of those trips, I ended up staying an extra day due to weather delays. I was exhausted and frustrated. Trapped in an airport hotel room that smelled like stale cigarettes no matter how much I aired it out, Mason called, and the moment I heard his voice, I felt better. We talked for over 2 hours about nothing important, what he'd had for dinner. A funny thing that had happened at work, a new show he'd started watching. But hearing him laugh, hearing the warmth in his voice, made the distance bearable. "I miss you," I said at one point, and it felt inadequate for the ache in my chest. "I miss you too," he replied softly. "But you'll be home tomorrow, and I'll be waiting." And he was. When I finally walked through our apartment door the next evening, he was there, and I dropped my bags and went straight to him. And everything felt right again. We started therapy around our 4th year together. Not because anything was wrong, but because we wanted to keep it that way. We'd seen too many relationships fall apart because people waited until things were broken to try to fix them. And we wanted to be proactive. Our therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Chen, helped us work through communication patterns, taught us better ways to express needs and boundaries, gave us tools for navigating conflict. Some sessions were easy, but others were hard, forcing us to examine parts of ourselves and our relationship that we'd been avoiding. But we came out stronger every time, more connected, more secure in what we'd built together. One particularly difficult session, Dr. Chen asked us about our families, about the complexity of our relationship origins. It was something we'd mostly stopped thinking about. Our parents were just our parents now, not this complicated web of step relationships. But she pushed us to examine whether we'd fully processed the unique challenges of our situation. Mason admitted he still sometimes felt guilty. It's like loving me was somehow betraying his family, or crossing a line he shouldn't have crossed. I admitted I worried people would always see us as taboo, as something wrong or inappropriate, no matter how normal it felt to us. Dr. Chen listened, and then said something that stuck with me. Love isn't wrong. It's never wrong when it's between two consenting adults who choose each other freely. The rest is just other people's baggage, and you don't have to carry it. That summer, we took our first real vacation together. We'd done weekend trips before, but this was different to weeks in a cabin in the mountains, completely off the grid, just us and nature and all the time in the world. We hiked during the days, pushed ourselves up mountain trails until our legs ached and our lungs burned. And the views from the top made every step worth it. We read books on the porch, cooked elaborate meals together, made love slowly in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. We talked about everything we never had time for in our regular live dreams and fears and philosophical questions that didn't have easy answers. It was the most present I'd felt in years, completely focused on the moment I was in rather than whatever came next. One night, we hiked up to a ridge to watch the sunset. The sky exploded into colors, pinks and oranges and purples that seemed almost too vibrant to be real. We sat on a flat rock, Mason's arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest, and watched the light fade into darkness. As the first stars appeared, Mason said quietly, "I want to marry you." I know we talked about waiting, about not making things more complicated with our families, but I don't care anymore. I want everyone to know that you're mine, and I'm yours. I want to make it official. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Are you proposing to me right now?" I asked, only half joking. "Yeah," he said, turning me to face him. "I guess I am. I don't have a ring this time, and I definitely didn't plan this. But, will you marry me?" For real this time? I kissed him instead of answering, poured everything I felt into it. Yes, and always, and forever. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I pressed my forehead to his. Yes, I said. 1,000 times yes. We stayed on that ridge until long after full dark, planning and dreaming and laughing at ourselves for being so ridiculously happy. We decided we'd do it back in the city, somewhere meaningful to us, with just close friends and the family members who truly supported us. Nothing big or fancy, just intimate and real. The kind of wedding that celebrated what we actually were to each other rather than what tradition said it should look like. We started planning as soon as we got back from vacation. Giddy with excitement and possibility, telling our parents was interesting. Mason's mom cried again, but this time they were definitely happy tears. My mom was thrilled, already offering to help with planning. Our dads were quieter about it, but both expressed their support in their own ways. The only real pushback came from some extended family members, cousins and aunts and uncles who still couldn't quite wrap their heads around our relationship. But we'd expected that, had prepared ourselves for it. We weren't doing this for them. We were doing it for us, and for everyone who'd stood by us and supported us and celebrated what we'd built together. Everyone else could either come around or stay away. We'd stopped trying to make everyone happy a long time ago. We got married on a Saturday in October. It's 4.5 years after that first kiss on the roof. The ceremony was in a small community garden in our neighborhood, surrounded by fall flowers and the people we loved most. Jamie from the youth center officiated. He'd gotten ordained online specifically so he could do it, which had made both Mason and I cry when he offered. I'd spent the morning getting ready with my best friend from grad school, who kept making jokes to cover up the fact that he was getting emotional. Mason had gotten ready with his work friend Chris, who later told me Mason had been a nervous wreck right up until the moment he saw me walking down the makeshift aisle. I'll never forget that moment, looking up and seeing Mason waiting for me, wearing a suit that made him look impossibly handsome, with an expression on his face that was pure love and joy and barely contained tears. Everything else faded away, and it was just him and me and the future we were promising each other. Jamie's ceremony was short and sweet, filled with personal touches and inside jokes that made our friends laugh. When it came time for vows, Mason went first. His voice shook as he talked about how I'd changed his life, how I'd shown him what real partnership looked like, how he promised to choose me every day for the rest of his life. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. My own vows were less eloquent but no less heartfelt. I told him about that first day at the quarry, how I'd felt something shift but been too afraid to name it. I told him about falling in love with him slowly and then all at once, about how he'd made me braver and better and more myself than I'd ever been alone. I promised to support his dreams, to hold him through the hard times, to laugh with him through the good ones, to build a life with him that was messy and beautiful and uniquely ours. When I slipped the ring on his finger, a new one, a wedding band to match the promise ring he still wore, my hands were shaking so badly he had to help me. But we managed, and then Jamie was pronouncing us married. And Mason was pulling me into a kiss that felt like coming home. The reception was in a restaurant we loved. Nothing fancy, but full of good food and better company. We danced badly, 'cause neither of us had any rhythm, and gave speeches that were too emotional, and ate cake and celebrated with the people who mattered most. Mason's father was there, sitting in the back, and at one point Mason went over to talk to him. I watched them from across the room, saw Mason's father say something that made Mason nod. Saw them hug awkwardly but genuinely. Later, Mason told me his father had apologized for missing so much of his life, but said he was grateful to be there for this. It wasn't perfect, would probably never be perfect, but it was something. That night, exhausted and happy and officially married, we collapsed into bed in our apartment and just held each other. We did it, Mason whispered. We really did it. And I realized he wasn't just talking about the wedding. He was talking about everything, surviving and thriving and building something that had seemed impossible 5 years ago. Now, as I sit here writing this, we've been married for 6 months. Life hasn't magically become easier or perfect. We still fight sometimes, still struggle with stress and money and all the regular challenges of being human. but we face them together, and that makes all the difference. We're in the process of buying a house, something with a yard and extra bedrooms, because we're seriously considering adoption. The thought terrifies and excites us in equal measure. We're still volunteering at the youth center now, as a married couple who can serve as proof that happy endings are possible. And we're still choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Sometimes I think about that scared kid I used to be, the one who thought he had everything figured out until Mason knocked on his door and turned his world upside down. I think about all the moments that let us hear the kisses and the fights. The tears and the laughter, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. I think about the courage it took to reach for something everyone told us was impossible or wrong or too complicated. And I'm grateful. Grateful for that first summer, grateful for every day since, grateful for whatever comes next. Mason just walked into the room, asking if I want to go for a walk before dinner. The evening light is hitting his face just right, and I can see the silver band on his finger catching the glow. And my breath catches like it still does sometimes when I look at him. Yeah, I tell him, saving this document and standing up. Let's go. And as we head out into the world together, hands intertwined, I think about how this is the big thing my half-brother showed me that summer, not just love, but the strength to claim it, to fight for it, to build a life around it. He showed me that family isn't always about blood or law or what other people think it should be. Sometimes family is who you choose, who chooses you back, who stands beside you and says, let's build something together, and means it. And I've been building ever since, and I'll keep building for the rest of my life. One day at a time, with him. The house hunt consumed us in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every weekend we'd pile into the car with a list of addresses. Armed with questions we'd researched online and dreams that felt both tangible and impossibly far away. Mason had become obsessed with finding the perfect place, scrolling through listings late at night, creating spreadsheets comparing prices and neighborhoods and school districts even though we didn't have kids yet. I'd tease him about it, but secretly I loved watching him plan our future with such careful attention. Like every decision mattered, because it was ours to make together. We saw dozens of houses, some too expensive, some too small, some in neighborhoods that didn't feel quite right. There was one Mason fell in love with immediately. A charming craftsman with original hardwood floors and a fireplace in the living room. But the inspection revealed problems we couldn't afford to fix, and I watched his face fall when we had to walk away from it. We got into our first serious argument in months that night. Both of us stressed and disappointed in taking it out on each other in ways that weren't fair. But we remembered our rule, stayed up talking it through. And by morning, we'd apologized and recalibrated. Ready to start the search? Again with fresh eyes and renewed patience. The house we eventually found wasn't the one either of us had pictured. It was in a neighborhood we'd almost overlooked, on a quiet street lined with old trees that formed a canopy overhead. The house itself was smaller than we'd wanted, a bit dated, and needed cosmetic work. But the moment we walked through the door, something clicked. There was a warmth to it, a sense of possibility. The backyard was huge, with an old oak tree, perfect for a swing someday. The extra bedroom upstairs had windows on 3 sides, flooding it with light. Mason looked at me, and I could see the same thing I was feeling reflected in his eyes. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is home." The buying process was stressful in ways nothing had prepared us for. There was paperwork that seemed endless, inspections and appraisals and negotiations that made my head spin. Our loan officer, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, had paused when she saw our relationship to each other on the application. "Stepbrothers?" she'd asked, her tone carefully neutral. Mason and I had exchanged a glance, and then I'd explained calmly, matter-of-factly, that our parents had married when we were teenagers, that we'd fallen in love as adults, that we were married now and building a life together. She'd processed this for a moment, then nodded and moved on. It was a reminder that we'd always have to explain, always have to justify, but we'd gotten better at it over the years. It didn't hurt as much as it used to. We closed on the house in early spring, just as everything was starting to bloom. Moving day was chaos. Friends from the youth center showed up to help, along with Mason's work colleagues and my grad school friends. There were too many people in too small a space. Everyone talking and laughing and getting in each other's way, but it felt joyful rather than overwhelming. At one point I looked across the room and saw Mason directing traffic, telling people where to put boxes, and I was struck by how comfortable he looked, how settled. This was really happening. We were homeowners. Adults with a mortgage and property taxes and a lawn we'd have to figure out how to maintain. That first night in the new house, surrounded by unpacked boxes and exhausted beyond belief, we ordered pizza and sat on the floor of what would become our living room. The house was quiet now, everyone gone, just us in the space that was ours. "We own this," Mason said, looking around with wonder in his voice. "Like, actually own it. This is our house." I leaned against him, feeling the solidity of him, the reality of the moment. "What do you want to do first?" I asked. He thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "I want to paint that back bedroom. Make it bright and cheerful. Just in case. Just in case we got approved for adoption. Just in case our family grew." The hope in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. We spent the next few months making the house our own. Weekends were devoted to painting walls, refinishing floors, arguing good-naturedly about color choices and furniture placement. Mason wanted to paint the back bedroom a soft yellow, sunny and warm. I'd suggested blue, calming and peaceful, but ultimately deferred to him because I could see how much it mattered. We worked side by side, getting paint in our hair and on our clothes, making mistakes and learning as we went. There was something deeply intimate about it, about literally building our home together, putting our mark on every room. Each decision felt significant, like we were creating not just a house, but the container for our entire future. The adoption process began that summer. We'd done our research, knew it would be long and complicated and emotionally draining, but we were ready. Or we thought we were. The reality of it, the home studies, the interviews, the invasive questions about every aspect of our lives was harder than we'd anticipated. We had to explain our relationship repeatedly to social workers and agencies and anyone who would be involved in the process. Some were accepting, even supportive. Others were clearly uncomfortable, though most were professional enough not to say so directly. One social worker, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, told us she thought we'd make excellent parents. Another suggested we might face challenges that traditional couples wouldn't, though she didn't specify what those challenges might be. The hardest part was the waiting. We'd submitted our application, completed all the requirements, and now it was just a matter of patience. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Every time the phone rang, we'd both tense up, hoping for news. Mason started obsessively checking his email, convinced he'd somehow missed the message that would change our lives. I tried to stay calm for both of us, but internally I was just as anxious. We'd talk about it endlessly. What kind of child we hoped for, how we'd handle parenting, what kind of fathers we wanted to be. These conversations were equal parts exciting and terrifying, making it all feel simultaneously real and impossibly distant. Work continued to be demanding for both of us, but we'd gotten better at balancing it with our home life. Mason's promotion had settled into a routine, and while the hours were still long, he was thriving. He'd found his stride, become more confident in his abilities and his value to the company. I loved watching him come into his own professionally, seeing him command respect and recognition he'd earned. My own career was progressing well too, though I'd turned down a recent opportunity that would have required relocating because it wasn't worth disrupting what we'd built. Mason had been upset when he found out, insisting I shouldn't sacrifice opportunities for him, but I'd been firm. Some opportunities weren't worth the cost, and moving away from this house, this life, this community we'd created wasn't something I was willing to do. We got the call on a Tuesday afternoon in October, almost exactly a year into the adoption process. Mason was at work, and I was home, and when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up, and the social worker on the other end said words that made my knees go weak. "We have a match for you, a little boy, 3 years old, who needed a family." His name was Ethan, and he'd been in foster care for over a year, and the social worker thought we might be a good fit. Could we come in to learn more about him? I said yes, obviously yes, and then I was calling Mason. barely able to get the words out through my excitement and terror. We met Ethan the following week. He was small for 3, with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed too serious for a child his age. He was shy initially, hiding behind the social worker. But Mason had thought to bring a small toy car, and when he offered it to Ethan, the boy's face lit up in a way that made something in my chest crack open. We spent an hour in that meeting room, playing cars on the floor, reading picture books, just being present with this little human who might become our son. When it was time to leave, Ethan hugged Mason goodbye, a brief squeeze that seemed to surprise even him. In the car afterward, Mason cried huge, overwhelming sobs that he tried to hide, and I pulled over and held him while he let it all out. The transition process was gradual. We had supervised visits first, then day visits, slowly building a relationship with Ethan while he remained in foster care. Each visit was precious and nerve-wracking. We'd plan activities carefully, trips to the park, art projects at our house, simple meals together. Ethan was cautious with us at first, clearly used to adults being temporary fixtures in his life. But slowly, incrementally, he started to trust. He started calling Mason Maze because he couldn't quite pronounce the full name. He'd reach for my hand when we crossed the streets. He laughed a beautiful, bright sound that we both became addicted to, doing anything we could to provoke it. The day Ethan moved in permanently was one of the best and most terrifying days of my life. We'd prepared the yellow bedroom carefully, filled it with toys and books, and a small bed with sheets, covered in dinosaurs because Ethan had mentioned once that he liked them. When we brought him home, for good this time, he stood in the doorway of his room with an expression we couldn't quite read. "This is mine?" he asked quietly, like he couldn't quite believe it. "All yours," Mason confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan walked in slowly, touching everything carefully, like he was afraid it might disappear. That night, when we tucked him into his new bed, he looked up at us with those serious eyes and asked, "You're staying?" And Mason and I both said yes. "We're staying. We're not going anywhere." And meant it with everything we had. Parenting was harder than anything we'd ever done. Ethan came with trauma we were only beginning to understand, nightmares that would wake him screaming. Fear of abandonment that manifested in clinginess and testing boundaries constantly. There were days when we felt completely out of our depth. We'd put him to bed and collapse on the couch exhausted and question whether we were equipped for this. But there were also moments of pure joy, Ethan's first genuine belly laugh in our home. The day he called us Dad and Papa for the first time. The morning we came downstairs to find him building an elaborate tower out of blocks. So focused and content that we just stood in the doorway watching him. We divided parenting duties in ways that played to our strengths. Mason was better at the playful stuff, getting down on the floor for epic car races, making up silly songs, turning everyday activities into adventures. I was better at structure and routine, making sure homework got done, maintaining bedtime schedules, preparing healthy meals. We learned to tag team, to recognize when one of us was at our limit and needed the other to step in. We learned to communicate even more carefully than before, because we couldn't afford to disagree about parenting decisions. In front of Ethan, we had to present a united front, while also respecting that we'd each have different approaches. Youth Center became part of Ethan's life too. We started bringing him to family events, and he attached himself particularly to Jamie, who was now in college but still volunteered regularly. Jamie was patient with Ethan in a way that amazed me, spending hours playing with him, reading to him, treating him with a gentleness that suggested he understood what it was like to feel different or uncertain about where you belonged. Watching them together, I'd think about how the center had given us so much community, purpose, family beyond blood. And now it was giving that to Ethan too. Ethan's first Christmas with us was magical in ways I couldn't have imagined. We went all out, decorated the house, baked cookies, took him to see lights and Santa. On Christmas morning, he woke us up at dawn, practically vibrating with excitement. And we sat in the living room, surrounded by wrapping paper, and watched him open presents with an enthusiasm that made all the stress and exhaustion of the past few months completely worth it. Our families came over later, both sets of parents, siblings, the whole complicated blended family that we'd all somehow become. Watching Ethan surrounded by grandparents and aunts and uncles, being loved and accepted and celebrated, I felt something settle in my chest. This was family. This was what we'd built. The first year with Ethan flew by and crept by simultaneously. There were challenges we hadn't anticipated, dealing with his preschool, managing his anxiety about new situations, helping him understand that we weren't going anywhere no matter what. Mason and I had to learn to maintain our relationship while also being parents, to carve out time for each other amidst the constant demands of a 3-year-old. We started doing weekly date nights again, getting a trusted babysitter so we could have a few hours to just be a couple. Those nights were precious, a reminder that we were partners first, and that our relationship was the foundation everything else was built on. Ethan started calling me Dad, and Mason Papa consistently around 6 months after moving in. We'd never pushed it, had told him he could call us by our names if that felt better. But he'd chosen these names himself, and they stuck. The first time he said "I love you, Dad" to me, completely unprompted. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom so he wouldn't see me cry. Mason found me there a few minutes later, and I told him what had happened, and then he was crying too. We stood in our bathroom, 2 grown men sobbing over 3 words from a 4-year-old. It was perfect and overwhelming in everything. We started documenting everything, photos and videos and journal entries, because we wanted Ethan to have a record of his childhood. Proof that he was loved and wanted and celebrated every single day. Mason started a tradition of writing Ethan a letter on his birthday every year, talking about who he was at that age, what he loved, funny things he'd said or done. The plan was to give them all to him when he turned 18. I loved this idea so much that I started doing it too, so he'd have both our perspectives, both our memories of watching him grow up. Around Ethan's 5th birthday, we started talking about maybe adopting again. The house had that extra bedroom we'd never quite figured out what to do with, and Ethan had started asking for a sibling. We weren't sure one child was already overwhelming in the best possible way, but we reached out to our social worker to explore the possibility. She told us about a situation: a sibling pair, a 7-year-old girl named Maya and her 5-year-old brother Lucas, who needed a home together and were proving hard to place because not many families wanted to take on 2 older children at once. Mason and I talked about it for weeks. 2 more children would change everything, would push us to our limits in ways we couldn't fully anticipate. But we kept coming back to the same thing we had loved to give. We had space in our home and our hearts, and these kids needed a family. We met Maya and Lucas on a Saturday afternoon, and they were both quiet and guarded in ways that broke our hearts. Maya was clearly protective of her brother, keeping him close, answering questions for him. Lucas had glasses that were slightly too big for his face and a nervous habit of pushing them up constantly. Ethan, who we'd brought along, immediately tried to engage Lucas in playing cars, and slowly, gradually, Lucas started to respond. The integration process was even harder the second time because we were trying to blend personalities and needs and trauma histories. Maya was angry a lot, testing boundaries constantly, clearly expecting us to give up on her. Lucas was anxious, needed constant reassurance, struggled with separation even for short periods. Ethan was jealous of the attention his new siblings required, acting out in ways he hadn't in months. There were days when our house felt like a war zone, and Mason and I would lie in bed at night wondering what we'd gotten ourselves into. But there were also breakthrough moments. The first time Maya laughed at one of Mason's terrible jokes. The morning Lucas crawled into bed with us during a thunderstorm. The afternoon we found all 3 kids playing together in the backyard, seemingly having forgotten their various grievances. 6 months after Maya and Lucas moved in, things started to settle. Not become easy exactly, but settle into a new normal. We had systems now, routines, that helped everyone feel secure. Mason had cut back his hours at work, recognizing that something had to give and choosing family. I'd done the same, turning down projects that would take me away from home too much. We were making less money, had less time for ourselves. And our house was constantly chaotic in ways that would have driven us crazy a few years ago. But we were also happier than we'd ever been. Our family, weird and blended and unconventional as it was, felt complete. The kids started calling us Dad and Papa interchangeably, which which caused some amusing confusion but also felt perfect. They didn't differentiate between us in terms of roles or importance. We were both just their parents. Equally responsible, equally loved. Mason and I had worried about how people would react to our family, whether we'd face discrimination or judgment, but mostly we encountered warmth. Teachers and neighbors and other parents saw what we saw through kids who were loved and cared for and thriving. The other stuff, the complicated origin story of how Mason and I came to be together, mostly didn't matter to anyone but us. We still volunteered at the youth center when we could, though less frequently now with 3 kids. We brought them sometimes, and they became part of that community too. The teens at the center loved having younger kids around, and Maya especially seemed to come alive there, helping out with activities, showing a nurturing side we didn't always see at home. One evening, watching her patiently teach a nervous 13-year-old how to do a craft project, I realized how far she'd come from that angry, guarded 7-year-old we'd first met, our 10th anniversary both of being together, and of that first summer came and went in a beautiful blur. We couldn't do anything elaborate with 3 kids, but Mason surprised me by recreating that first day at the quarry. We packed the kids up, drove out to that same spot, and spent the afternoon swimming and laughing. Ethan and Lucas jumped off the rocks fearlessly, while Maya sat with us, reading a book, but occasionally looking up to smile at her brother's antics. At one point, Mason took my hand and squeezed it. "You remember?" he asked quietly. I did. I remembered everything, the nervousness, the electricity, the way that single afternoon had changed the trajectory of my entire life. That evening, after we got the kids to bed, Mason and I sat on our back porch with glasses of wine, watching fireflies dance in the yard. "I never imagined this," I said, gesturing vaguely at everything in the house. The kids sleeping upstairs, the life we'd built. Never imagined it could be this good. Mason leaned his head on my shoulder. "Me neither," he admitted. "That summer, when I knocked on your door, I was just bored and lonely. I had no idea I was knocking on the door to the rest of my life." I turned to kiss him, slow and sweet. A kiss that held 10 years of history and hopefully 50 more years of future. The thing about love, real love, the kind that lasts, that it's not actually about the big moments. It's not about dramatic declarations or grand gestures, though those have their place. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. It's about building something together, brick by brick, day by day, till you've created a life that's so intertwined you can't tell where one person ends and the other begins. It's about compromise and communication and constant work to maintain what you've built. But when you find the right person, when you find your person, that work doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. Mason is calling me from inside now, saying one of the kids needs me for something. In a minute, I'll go in, deal with whatever minor crisis has emerged, kiss my children goodnight again, and then curl up next to my husband in the bed we've shared for years. Tomorrow we'll wake up and do it all again, the breakfast chaos. The school runs, the work calls, the homework help, the dinner negotiations, the bedtime routines. It will be ordinary and exhausting and occasionally frustrating. And it will be absolutely perfect because it's ours. That summer 10 years ago, my half-brother, though he's so much more than that, now showed me something big. He showed me that love doesn't follow rules or conventions. He showed me that family is what you make it, not what biology or law dictates. He showed me that sometimes the biggest risk leads to the greatest reward. He showed me who I could be when I was brave enough to reach for what I wanted instead of what was expected. And every day since, we've been showing each other new things, how to be partners, how to be parents, how to build a life that honors both our individuality and our togetherness. This is our story. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not conventional, but it's ours. And I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more authentic LGBTQ+ stories that celebrate love in all its forms. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories about finding yourself, choosing love, and building the family you deserve. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.